I'm Taghi Farvar from Iran, originally from a member of the Shah-Sevan tribe of nomadic peoples. I'm based in Iran. I'm the chair of a civil society organization called CENESTA, which is the Center for Sustainable Development and the Environment in Iran. I'm also the president of the ICCA Consortium, which is a consortium of members who are either indigenous peoples organizations or mostly small or medium NGOs that are working on and supporting community conservation.
Okay.
Our basic premise is that nature is alive and still there and interesting and beautiful because indigenous peoples and local communities have known how to conserve it for thousands of years, whereas now new actors like governments or experts or universities or NGOs are coming along and thinking that they know more than the local communities and indigenous peoples about conservation, which is not true. So we're promoting the fact that local communities and indigenous peoples are the oldest conservationists on earth, and if anywhere some element of biodiversity is disappearing, it's because the indigenous peoples or local communities that lived there and had the knowledge and science of how to protect it are disappearing. ICCAs are indigenous and community conserved areas and territories. Indigenous people usually refer to their areas as territories because they're supported by international law for their territories. And local communities, by that I mean traditional local communities, because you could have an artificial local community created today, even by governments, that doesn't really have the knowledge and experience and the deep care for nature, whereas traditional local communities and indigenous people are always caring about their environment. Those who didn't care for the environment are not there today to tell their story. Okay, in Iran, I think I can claim that most of the country consists of ICCAs. We have, for example, 100 nomadic, what do you call them? In English it's called confederacies, tribal confederacies that are nomads, and 600 independent tribes that are also nomadic. And every one of them has a territory which depends on the season. For example, where we have a lot of topography with highlands and lowlands, usually a tribe will go up the mountains in the summer and go down to the valleys in the winter to keep the best conditions for pastures and for water availability and so forth. And in fact, they learned how to migrate seasonally from the animals, from wild animals that they used to depend on 10 or 12,000 years ago. That's how old nomadic peoples are in our region. They started to follow these animals because they had always been dependent on them. They realized that the animals migrate seasonally. They go down in the winter, come up in the summer. So they started following them. Little by little, they domesticated them. And then when they domesticated the dog, herds became possible because dogs are much better herders than humans. So, and ever since then, they've kept this. In other words, the main reason nomads migrate at the end of a season is because they want to conserve nature. If they don't conserve it, next year nature will have nothing to offer them and they'll be punished. Also, many sedentary societies are also conservationists since a very long time. They conserve birds or they conserve fish, or they know how to create conserved areas where, for example, in the breeding season of fish, they won't fish. In the breeding season of birds, they won't even go near the breeding sites, for example, in marshlands or in wetlands or what have you. And wildlife, all the community elders tell us, in the nomadic society, herds of wildlife would migrate in parallel with the herds of domesticated animals, and sometimes they'd mix, intermingle. At night they'd each go to their own territories and sleep, and the next day it was there. So nomads talk about how a lot of government interference and private sector intrusion and let's say academic ignorance has caused the brotherhood, as they say, of wildlife and livestock to be upset. Otherwise, like we had one example out of many such examples where a community elder in the Turkmen tribe in northeast Iran called the provincial office of the Department of the Environment and said, "Hey, rush here! There's a leopard that has attacked our herd and has hurt and killed a few cows and animals." So the government experts quickly came with their checkbooks and forms to compensate the community. When they got there and they said, "Where is it? Show us, and we're ready to compensate you." He said, "Compensate us? We didn't call you to get compensation. We called you because we're worried about the fate of that leopard, because there could be some young people who don't follow us elders' advice, and they could harm this animal. So we wanted you to come here and do something so that animal doesn't suffer and is not punished. If the animal takes some of our wildlife, it is what we say in Persian and Arabic, it's the zakat for our wildlife. It's the thanks being offered for it. They're welcome to take it." And this kind of attitude is all over the place. And governments and intellectuals typically don't see that. They think local communities are ignorant. They think they have to raise their awareness, and yet I think the local communities need to raise the awareness of people in government and private sector and in academia. So basically an ICCA, or a community conserved area, or an indigenous peoples conserved territory, is where you have an area, an ecosystem, or a piece of it, and you have a people, a tribe, a village, a community, and they have a relationship of mutual dependence, and the result of that relationship is conservation. Whether it was meant strictly for conservation originally, or it's a byproduct of it. And that is, for example, different from the IUCN definition of protected area, which has to be dedicated for this purpose. But for people in the rural areas and for nomads and all that, there's no difference between livelihood and conservation. They're one and the same. So it's a very artificial separation, which I think needs to be overcome in order for us to be able to do better conservation. In Iran, I can tell you what we're doing. We at Senesta, even though we're a small, relatively small civil society organization, right now we have a pilot project on recognition and support of ICCAs of community conserved areas and indigenous peoples conserved territories, which extends over 15% of the gross territory of the country. That's how we think about the pilot project. The pilot project is not just a single village somewhere nearby where you can manage it. It's big because we want to test it under different conditions. And we've got a very close relationship with the government where they're entrusting us with this style of conservation, with actually recognizing and formalizing, but not interfering with the governance structures of local communities and indigenous peoples. Because there have been countries, Madagascar is a case in point, who said, wow, we have all these community conserved areas, and if we can recognize them, we will triple or quadruple our protected areas. And so they started to do that, but they also said, they passed the law saying that they recognize these, but the ICCAs, the community conserved areas, have to follow particular governance systems, which were all artificial, external, government-induced, or, you know, in much of French-speaking Africa, they refer to La Loi de 1901, the 1901 law, which is the French law that permitted the creation of associations. And in Africa, they still refer it by the French name of 1901 law. And yet, that's an artificial thing that's induced from somewhere else. It is an association is by necessity a collection of individuals. A tribe or a local community is not individuals. It is a collection of individuals which has new properties, which has a history, which has culture, which has a particular relationship with natural resources, which has governance systems, which has institutions, and we don't see that. The Western idea of a community is anything that happens at the local level, even if it's a couple of elites exploiting everybody else. So we go after helping the local communities and the indigenous peoples, say the nomadic tribes, organize themselves, following their own customary institutions of governance. And that is what seems to work best for conservation, for handling things like subsistence and livelihood projects, and for everything else, and for development. So we are in fact saying that in the Aichi target, which is a 10-year strategy of the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, was approved in a place called Aichi in Japan in 2010. And these are 20 objectives or goals for 2020. One of them, number 11, says that every country must report by 2020 that they have at least 17% of their inland territories and waters conserved, and at least 10% of marine and coastal areas conserved. And our government in Iran was saying, oh my God, we can't do that. How are we going to do that? Are we going to kick out more people and declare them as protected areas? We can't do that anymore. And we met with them and convinced them that, in fact, there is a phrase in Aichi Target 11 which says, and other effective area-based conservation measures. For us, this means primarily ICCAs, places that communities are conserved. So we've convinced them, and they are hoping, we're all hoping, that much more than 17% and 10% can be recognized and supported, but not interfered with in terms of governance within the next 4 or 5 years. We're doing that. We're doing that so that as all of CBD and all of IUCN, for example, in the new IUCN matrix of protected areas, where there is a axis added for governance types, that these are the community conserved areas and indigenous conserved territories are appropriately recognized, and they come to a position of prevalence by the year 2000. We're hoping that we can also influence many countries to take this path, because if you don't involve local communities and indigenous peoples in conservation, you're losing your best experts on conservation.
Yes.